Picture this, the year is 1281, and the mightiest empire the world has ever seen is about to strike. The Mongol war machine, unstoppable across continents, has turned its gaze toward Japan. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of warriors, an unstoppable force until the sky itself answered with fury. This is the story of how two gods, Raijin and Fujin, became the divine shield of Japan, unleashing nature's wrath to repel the largest naval invasion in history. For centuries, the Mongols had carved a path of conquest from Europe to the edges of Asia, bending nations to their will. But when their fleets reached Japan's shores, something extraordinary happened. Legend tells of black storms rising from nowhere, winds so violent they shattered ships like twigs, thunder so deafening it shook the very bones of the invaders. This was no ordinary storm. This was the work of Raijin, the tempestuous god of thunder, and Fujin, the relentless god of wind. Together, they didn't just fight the Mongols, they erased them from the sea. So how did two deities single-handedly turn the tide of history? The answer lies in the heart of Japanese mythology, where gods walk among mortals and nature itself bends to their will. Raijin, with his drums that shake the heavens, and Fujin, whose gusts can level mountains, weren't just forces of destruction. They were protectors answering the prayers of a nation on the brink. This tale isn't just about a battle, it's about faith, divine intervention, and the moment the impossible became real. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why, to this day, the Kamikaze, the divine wind, remains one of the most awe-inspiring legends ever told. The Mongols had never faced defeat until they set their sights on Japan. By 1274, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the largest contiguous empire in history, had already conquered Korea and China. Now he demanded Japan's submission. When the samurai rulers of Japan refused, Kublai sent a fleet of nearly 900 ships carrying over 30,000 warriors. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a tidal wave of steel and fire, a force that had crushed every army in its path. The samurai, though fierce, were outnumbered and unprepared for the Mongols' brutal tactics. Poison-tipped arrows, explosive gunpowder weapons, and coordinated cavalry strikes that had devastated empires. The first invasion in 1274 struck Kyushu, Japan's southernmost major island. Mongol troops landed near Hakata Bay, overwhelming local defenses with sheer numbers. Japanese accounts describe the terror of facing an enemy who fought like no other, their formations tight, their arrows raining death from a distance. But just as the Mongols pushed inland, something miraculous happened. A storm rolled in with furious speed, sinking nearly a third of their fleet and forcing the survivors to retreat. The Japanese called it Kamikaze, the divine wind. Yet Kublai Khan wasn't done. 7 years later, in 1281, he launched an even larger force, the largest amphibious invasion in history until World War II. This time, the armada numbered over 4,000 ships, carrying a staggering 140,000 soldiers, sailors, and Korean conscripts. The scale was unimaginable. If you lined up every ship bow to stern, it would stretch over 60 miles. For weeks, Mongol troops clashed with samurai along the beaches, their superior numbers slowly grinding down Japan's defenses. But once again, as hope seemed lost, the skies answered. A typhoon of apocalyptic force descended, churning the sea into a graveyard of shattered timber and drowned men. The Mongols, masters of the open steppe, had no defense against the wrath of the ocean. Of their mighty fleet, only a handful of broken ships returned home. Japan, against all odds, stood unconquered. What made these storms so extraordinary wasn't just their timing, it was their ferocity. Survivors spoke of waves like mountains, winds that ripped men from decks, and rain so thick it blinded entire crews. To the Japanese, this wasn't nature's whim. This was the hand of Raijin and Fujin, the gods who had chosen a side, And in that moment, a legend was born, one that would shape Japan's identity for centuries. The Mongols never returned. Their empire would crumble, but the tale of the divine wind would endure, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of a nation protected by its gods. Kamikaze, the word itself carries the weight of legend. Today, it might evoke images of wartime sacrifice, but its true roots stretch back to that fateful summer of 1281, when the skies themselves seemed to declare Japan invincible. Literally meaning divine wind, the term was born from the unshakable belief that no mortal force, not even the Mongol Empire, could stand against the will of the gods. When those apocalyptic storms obliterated Kublai Khan's armada, it wasn't just luck or weather to the people of Japan. It was divine intervention, a celestial verdict written in thunder and waves. What made this belief so powerful wasn't just the timing of the storms. It was their sheer unnatural fury. Historical records from Korea and China describe typhoons, yes, but nothing like the concentrated devastation that struck the Mongol fleets. Waves reportedly towered over ships, swallowing them whole. Winds ripped sails to shreds and hurled men overboard like leaves in a gale, and the thunder. Survivors wrote of it sounding like drums, an eerie detail that would later cement the connection to Raijin, the thunder god whose taiko drums were said to shake the heavens. To a culture steeped in Shinto beliefs, where every mountain, river, and storm held a spirit, this wasn't coincidence. This was Raijin and Fujin standing guard over the sacred islands. The legend only grew in the centuries that followed. Medieval scrolls depict the storms as swirling dragons, their serpentine bodies wrapped around sinking ships, while priests claim to have seen the gods themselves riding the cloud. Temples sprang up along the Kyushu coast, honoring the Kamikaze as a sacred barrier, one that would protect Japan so long as its people remained devout. Even the samurai, practical warriors though they were, embraced the myth. Their victory wasn't just military, it was spiritual proof that their land was chosen. But here's where history and belief intertwine in fascinating ways. Modern scholars note that typhoons do strike Japan regularly in late summer, yet none have ever matched the sheer destructive precision of the 1281 storm. Was it truly supernatural, or did the Mongols, unfamiliar with the region's treacherous seas, anchor their fleet in vulnerable positions? What's undeniable is how the Kamikaze became a cultural touchstone. By the Edo period, the story had morphed into national legend, with artists painting Raijin and Fujin hurling lightning and gales at the invaders. The storms became more than weather, they were the embodiment of Japan's unconquerable spirit. And that's why the Kamikaze legacy endured far beyond the medieval era. When World War II pilots took the name centuries later, they weren't just invoking sacrifice. They were tapping into that ancient idea of divine winds protecting the homeland. Even today, the word lingers in shrines and festivals, a reminder that some victories defy explanation. Because whether you see those storms as acts of gods or freak acts of nature, one truth remains: twice when annihilation seemed certain, the wind answered. To understand Raijin's fury, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a tale of death, decay, and divine rebellion. According to ancient texts, Raijin wasn't born like other gods. His origin story is steeped in the macabre, tied to one of Shinto's most pivotal moments, the death of Izanami, the primordial goddess of creation. When Izanami perished giving birth to the fire god Kagetsuchi, her grieving husband Izanagi descended into Yomi, the underworld, to bring her back. But what he found there horrified him. Izanami's once radiant body had rotted, crawling with maggots and shrouded in darkness. In his terror, Izanagi fled, sealing her in the land of the dead. But not before Izanami vowed to kill 1,000 living souls every day in revenge. And from her decaying remains, a new force emerged, Raijin, the god of thunder, born from the wrath of the underworld itself. This grotesque origin explains Raijin's untamed nature. Unlike refined deities who bring order, he embodies chaos, a capricious spirit who answers to no one. Ancient art depicts him as a red-skinned demon with wild hair, surrounded by a ring of drums. Those aren't just for show. Each strike of his taiko drums summons thunderclaps, and when he beats them in frenzy, entire villages tremble. Farmers prayed to him for rain, but also feared his tantrums. One wrong move, and he'd split trees with lightning or set fields ablaze. Yet this unpredictability made him indispensable. In Shinto belief, storms weren't just weather. They were the boundary between the human and spirit worlds, and Raijin was their undisputed master. His connection to the Mongols' defeat wasn't just symbolic. Japanese folklore is filled with tales of Raijin intervening in mortal affairs, often alongside his brother Fujin. Together, they represented the dual nature of storms. Raijin's thunder brought destruction, but also purification, washing away impurity with torrential rains. When the Mongol fleets appeared, it wasn't just wine that struck them, it was Raijin's divine judgment, his drums echoing across the waves like a war cry from the gods. Even today, traces of Raijin's legacy endure. At temples like Kyoto's iconic Sanjusanjin-do, statues show him mid-beat, frozen in eternal motion. During seasonal festivals, performers reenact his myth with thunderous taiko performances, the vibration said to ward off evil. And in rural villages, some still leave offerings at shrines, begging his mercy before storm season. Because while modern science explains typhoons, for many, Raijin remains the wild, untamable force behind the thunder, proof that some gods refuse to be civilized. If Raijin was the thunder that shook the Mongols, Fujin was the wind that broke them, an ancient force of nature wrapped in a legend just as fierce. Unlike his thunderous brother, Fujin's origins are shrouded in the primal chaos of the world's creation, born from the same breath that first stirred the oceans and carved the mountains. In Japanese art, he's a terrifying sight, a demonic figure with wild green hair, his bulging mouth eternally open as he unleashes gales from the massive sack slung over his shoulder. That bag isn't just a prop, it's said to hold every storm, hurricane, and breeze that has ever swept across the islands, tied shut with a single knot that, if loosened, could flatten cities. Fujin's role in the Kamikaze legend isn't just about brute force. In Shinto belief, wind isn't merely destruction, it's movement, change, the invisible hand that guides fate. Farmers prayed to Fujin for gentle breezes to carry seeds. Sailors begged his mercy before setting sail, but when provoked, his wrath was unmatched. During the Mongol invasions, it wasn't just wine that struck, it was his wind, the kind that folklore warns can peel flesh from bone. Survivors' accounts describe gusts so powerful they snapped masts like kindling and hurled armored warriors into the sea as if they weighed nothing. To the Japanese watching from shore, this wasn't weather. It was Fujin emptying his sack, yet Fujin's legacy stretches far beyond Japan. Compare him to Greece's Aeolus, who trapped winds in a leather bag for Odysseus, or the Norse god Njord, whose breath guided Viking ships. But while other wind deities were often allies to humanity, Fujin was untamed, a reminder that nature answers to no one. Even in China, where the wind god Fei Lion shared his bag of wind's motif, the stories lacked Fujin's ferocity. There's something uniquely primal about the Japanese wind god, a reflection of an archipelago where typhoons could erase entire villages in an hour. The Mongols learned this the hard way. Their ships built for river conquests were no match for Fujin's fury. Legends say the wind god's sack had been still for years before the invasion, as if waiting for the moment to strike. When he finally opened it, the gales didn't just scatter the fleet, they twisted it, driving ships into each other in a nightmare of splintered wood and drowning men. Modern meteorologists might call it a once-in-a-millennium storm, but to the people of Japan, it was Fujin's will made visible, and in the centuries that followed, his legend only grew. Temples dedicated to him dot the coastlines, their priests performing rituals to keep his sack securely tied. Even now, when a typhoon approaches, some still whisper his name, not just in fear but in gratitude. Because for all his violence, Fujin was never just a destroyer. He was the protector who chose a side, the wind that shaped history. Raijin and Fujin weren't just gods. They were brothers, bound by blood and chaos, a divine duo whose relationship swung between harmony and havoc like the storms they commanded. In some myths, they're inseparable allies, working in perfect sync to unleash typhoons that reshape coastlines. In others, they're bitter rivals, their clashes echoing across the sky as thunder battles win for dominance. This push and pull dynamic made them unpredictable, even to other deities. One moment, Fujin's gusts might carry Raijin's thunderbolts with pinpoint accuracy, striking down enemies like a celestial artillery. The next, their feud could spiral into natural disasters so violent, even the sun hid behind the clouds. Take the legend of their greatest collaboration, the sinking of the Mongol fleets. Historical texts describe the storm as a symphony of destruction, with Raijin's drums setting the tempo while Fujin's winds conducted the chaos. Waves didn't just rise, they danced, hurling ships into the air like toys. Lightning didn't merely strike, it hunted, seeking out Mongol banners with eerie precision. This wasn't random violence, it was a calculated strike, proof of what happened when the brothers set aside their squabbles and focused their wrath. Yet their unity was fragile. Older tales whisper of times their rivalry spiraled out of control, like the infamous Year of the Shattered Sky, when a petty argument over whose power mattered more led to a month-long tempest that drowned villages and split ancient trees in half. Farmers left offerings at shrines, begging them to stop, but Raijin and Fujin were too lost in their contest until the sun goddess Amaterasu herself intervened, threatening to plunge the world into eternal night if they didn't cease. What makes their bond so fascinating isn't just its volatility, it's how it mirrors nature itself. Storms aren't predictable. Some bring life-giving rain, others leave only ruin. Raijin and Fujin embody that duality, their relationship a reminder that even gods must balance creation and destruction. Modern meteorologists might call it low-pressure systems colliding, but to the ancients, every typhoon was a glimpse into the brothers' endless negotiation, a divine tension that, even today, keeps Japan's skies alive with thunder and wind. Shinto, Japan's ancient spiritual tradition, doesn't just worship gods, it lives alongside them. At the heart of this belief are the kami, spirits or deities that inhabit everything from towering mountains to rustling leaves. Unlike distant, all-powerful gods of other traditions, the kami are deeply entangled with human life, sometimes benevolent, sometimes capricious, but always present. Raijin and Fujin weren't just forces of nature in this worldview. They were active guardians, their tempests a direct response to the prayers of a people under siege. What made Shinto's perspective unique was its intimacy with the divine. Kami weren't locked away in celestial realms, they walked the same earth as mortals, their moods shaping harvests, wars, and even the weather. A successful fisherman might thank the local sea kami. A collapsed bridge could signal the displeasure of a river spirit. This wasn't metaphor, it was daily reality. So when the Mongol fleets darkened the horizon, it wasn't just a military crisis, it was a spiritual one. The kami of Japan were under attack, and Raijin and Fujin's fury wasn't just a storm, it was a reckoning. The idea of divine protection runs deep in Shinto. Sacred spaces like Ai's Grand Shrine, home to the sun goddess Amaterasu, were believed to form a spiritual barrier around Japan. Stories told of kami shielding the islands before, like when the legendary Empress Jingu prayed for winds to carry her fleet to conquer Korea. But the Mongol invasions tested this faith like never before. Here was an enemy that had steamrolled every culture in its path, a force so vast it seemed unstoppable. Yet when the Kamikaze struck, it wasn't just a twist of fate. To the people, it was proof that the kami still fought for them. Raijin and Fujin embodied Shinto's dual view of the divine. They weren't tidy, moralistic gods. They were raw, untamed forces. Raijin's thunder could destroy a village, but it also purified, cleansing the land with rain. Fujin's winds might sink ships, yet they also carried pollen and seeds, nurturing life. This duality made them perfect protectors. The Mongols, with their foreign gods and brutal tactics, represented impurity, a threat to the sacred balance of the islands. The brothers' storms didn't just repel invaders, they restored kegare, the spiritual cleanliness central to Shinto practice. Even the timing of the Kamikaze resonated with Shinto rituals. The invasions coincided with Obon, the festival when ancestral spirits returned to the living. To the Japanese, it was no accident that the storms struck then. The kami and ancestors were working in unison. Priests at shrines like Hakazaki in Kyushu later claimed they'd conducted secret ceremonies to summon the gods, tying prayers to trees so Fujin would carry them into battle. Whether true or not, the belief itself became a weapon. For centuries after, Shinto leaders invoked the Kamikaze as a warning: disrespect the kami and risk their wrath. This wasn't blind superstition, it was a sophisticated theology of interconnectedness. In Shinto, humans and kami exist in a reciprocal relationship. Offerings, prayers, and purity rituals weren't empty gestures, they were threads in a living web binding the divine to the mundane. When the people of Japan faced annihilation, they didn't just beg for salvation. They reminded the kami of that bond, and in their darkest hour, the thunder and wind answered. That's why the legend endured long after the Mongols faded. It wasn't just about survival, it was a testament to a world where gods and humans still fought side by side. The first Mongol invasion of Japan in 1274 wasn't just a military clash, it was a collision of two worlds. Kublai Khan's forces, fresh from their conquest of Korea, landed on the shores of Kyushu with terrifying efficiency. Armed with explosive gunpowder bombs and tactics honed across continents, they cut through samurai defenses like a scythe through wheat. The Japanese had never faced an enemy like this: disciplined, ruthless, and relentless. Mongol archers fired in synchronized volleys, their poison-tipped arrows turning the beaches into killing fields. Local warriors, used to the honorable duels of Bushido, found themselves outmatched by an army that fought without rules. Yet just as the Mongols pushed inland, the sky darkened. What began as a summer squall erupted into a tempest so violent, it seemed the sea itself had turned against the invaders. Waves taller than castles crashed onto the shore, swallowing ships whole. Winds shredded sails and snapped masts like twigs. The Mongols, masters of the open steppe, were suddenly at the mercy of an element they couldn't control: water. Within hours, their fleet was in ruins, a third of their vessels lost to the churning depths. Survivors scrambled back to their remaining ships, abandoning their hard-won foothold in a panicked retreat. To the Japanese watching from the cliffs, this wasn't just a stroke of luck. The storm had arrived with uncanny timing, striking precisely when defeat seemed inevitable. Priests at Hakazaki Shrine later claimed they'd prayed for divine intervention, their rituals calling upon the kami of wind and thunder. The Mongols, meanwhile, blamed poor weather forecasting. But was it really just bad luck? Historical records from Korea describe similar storms in the region, yet none with the same precision or ferocity. The typhoon of 1274 didn't just scatter the Mongol fleet, it annihilated their momentum, buying Japan 7 critical years to prepare. The aftermath revealed something even more striking. Among the wreckage, locals found strange relics: explosive pots filled with shrapnel, armor lined with silk to repel arrows, maps marking every cove and inlet of Kyushu. The Mongols hadn't just come to raid, they'd come to stay, and that realization turned the storm from a reprieve into a warning. If the kami had indeed answered Japan's prayers, it wasn't out of kindness, it was a test. The next invasion wouldn't be a surprise, and the next storm, it would need to be stronger. 7 years after the first failed invasion, Kublai Khan returned with a force so vast it defied imagination. In the summer of 1281, the horizon off Japan's coast vanished beneath an armada of over 4,000 ships, a fleet larger than any assembled until the modern era. This wasn't just another attack, it was annihilation engineered on a cosmic scale. The Mongols had learned from their earlier defeat, this time sending a two-pronged assault, one fleet from Korea, another from southern China, converging like pincers around Kyushu. Their ranks swelled with 140,000 soldiers, sailors, and conscripts, nearly half the population of medieval London at the time. And they brought nightmares with them: siege engines capable of hurling flaming projectiles, armored cavalry trained to fight in shallow water, and a brutality honed across decades of conquest. For weeks, the samurai fought a desperate holding action along the beaches. The Mongols, now familiar with Japanese tactics, used their overwhelming numbers to grind down defenses. They built floating fortresses, linked ships forming makeshift islands, to bypass coastal strongholds. Japanese chronicles describe the horror of their new weapons: iron-cased bombs filled with gunpowder and scrap metal that exploded in showers of shrapnel, a sound so alien it sent horses stampeding in terror. The samurai, though outmatched, made the Mongols pay for every inch of sand. Night raids, guerrilla strikes, even underwater divers slashing at anchor ropes, nothing was off the table. But as the invasion stretched into August, exhaustion set in. The Japanese were running out of land to trade for time. Then, on the 15th day of the 8th lunar month, a date etched into history, the sky split open. What began as a murmur of wind swelled into a roar that drowned out the screams of battle. The typhoon of 1281 wasn't just a storm, it was a living thing, a monster carved from rain and rage. Chinese records describe waves reaching 60 feet, swallowing entire ships in a single gulp. Korean accounts tell of winds so strong they peeled armor from men's bodies, hurling them into the sea like discarded husks. The Mongols' floating fortresses became death traps, their interlocked ships capsizing in unison like dominoes. For 48 hours, the tempest raged, churning the straits into a graveyard of splintered wood and drowned ambitions. The numbers still stagger historians. Of the 4,000 ships that sailed, fewer than 1 in 10 survived. Tens of thousands of Mongol troops and their horses vanished beneath the waves, their bodies washing ashore for months. A grim harvest that fed crows from Kyushu to Honshu. Japanese fishermen later spoke of nets heavy with strange cargo, shattered swords, gold-plated armor, even the occasional bloated corpse still clutching a banner emblazoned with the Khan's crest. But perhaps the most chilling detail comes from a surviving Mongol officer's diary, found centuries later in a Korean archive. The sea rose like a wall. The gods themselves fought against us. To the Japanese, this wasn't hyperbole, it was confirmation. The Kamikaze had returned, but this time with a vengeance that bordered on biblical. Priests claimed the storm's eye formed the shape of Raijin's grinning face, his drums echoing in the thunder. Fishermen swore they saw Fujin racing across the waves, his green hair streaming behind him as he tore the sails from masts with bare hands. The storm's timing coinciding with the peak of Oben, when ancestral spirits walked the earth, only deepened the sense of divine choreography. Even the Mongols' technological edge became their undoing. Their heavy iron armor, perfect for steppe warfare, dragged them straight to the bottom when the waves took them. Modern meteorologists still debate the storm's origins. Some argue it was a perfect typhoon, its path funneled by rare pressure systems between Korea and Japan. Others point to tree ring data showing a spike in rainfall that summer, evidence of a climate anomaly. But no scientific theory can explain why this storm, above all others, struck with such surgical precision. Two invasions, two miraculous reprieves, and at the heart of both, the same unshakable truth. The Mongols could conquer empires, but against the fury of Raijin and Fujin, even the mightiest warlord was just another mortal begging for mercy. The surviving records of the Mongol invasions read like scenes from a mythic epic, except these aren't folktales. They're first-hand accounts etched onto scrolls and diaries by men who watched the sky itself turn against them. Take the Hachiman Gudokan, a Japanese war chronicle penned by priests who witnessed the 1281 typhoon. Their description chills the blood. Winds like serpents coiled around the enemy ships, snapping them apart as if they were dry reeds. Thunder rolled not from clouds but from the belly of the sea, and with each peal another vessel vanished beneath the waves. But here's what's fascinating: the same tempest appears in a Mongol commander's report to Kublai Khan, now preserved in Beijing's archives. His version is clinical, stripped of divine imagery, yet just as terrifying. The ocean became a mountain range. Our fleet, strung across 30 li, was swallowed in less time than it takes to boil rice. These parallel narratives reveal more than just a storm. They expose the cultural lens through which disaster was understood. Japanese accounts frame the kamikaze as a conscious act of the gods, with Raijin and Fujin personally directing the chaos. One Kyushu fisherman's testimony, recorded decades later, claims he saw the wind god's green hair flickering between the sheets of rain, his sack torn open to unleash hell. Compare that to the Korean Goryeo annals written by scholars under Mongol rule. Their description is raw, pragmatic. Ships collided like drunkards in the dark, their hulls bursting upon impact, yet even they couldn't resist noting the freakish precision of the destruction. Why did the typhoon spare every Japanese coastal village? Why did it strike the exact hour the Mongol vanguard was attempting a night landing? Then there's the matter of numbers. A Chinese court astronomer's log from 1281 mentions an eerie celestial omen weeks before the storm. The constellation of the black tortoise bled red, and the wind stars trembled. Modern historians dismiss this as superstitious record-keeping until you cross-reference it with tree ring data from Hakon's ancient cedars. Their growth patterns confirm an unprecedented atmospheric disturbance that summer, with sulfur deposits suggesting a volcanic eruption may have intensified the typhoon. Science explains the storm's power, but not its timing, not its selectivity, and that's where the line between history and legend dissolves. Perhaps the most telling detail comes from an unlikely source, a letter by a Persian merchant stranded in Hakata Bay during the first invasion. His account, preserved in a Baghdad library, describes Mongol soldiers' men who'd crossed the go-by without flinching, kneeling on decks to pray as the wind shredded their sails. They cursed this land, he wrote, not for its warriors but for its gods. That single line captures the psychological toll of the kamikaze. The Mongols, masters of earthly warfare, had no defense against an enemy that fought with the very air they breathed. Even their later attempts to placate Shinto shrines with offerings gold, silk, even a rare white horse couldn't erase the terror, because how do you negotiate with a storm? What makes these records so compelling isn't just their drama, it's how they mirror the anxiety of their writers. The Japanese priests framed the storm as vindication, proof their rituals had summoned divine protection. The Mongol scribes, writing for a humiliated emperor, downplayed the supernatural, blaming faulty shipbuilding instead. But beneath the spin, both sides agreed on one thing: this was no ordinary tempest. Whether by kami or current, the wind had chosen a side, and in that moment, history stopped being something men could control. Raijin's drums weren't just instruments, they were weapons of psychological warfare. Each beat a tremor that shook the Mongols to their core. Imagine the scene. As the typhoon raged, thunder didn't just crack. It rolled, a rhythmic barrage like war drums from the heavens. Japanese folklore describes these celestial taiko as massive barrel-shaped drums, strapped to Raijin's back as he leaped between clouds, striking them with bone-white mallets. Every impact sent shockwaves through the air, but to the Mongol troops trapped on those ships, the sound carried something worse than noise. It carried intent. To a culture steeped in Shinto beliefs, thunder was Raijin's voice, a divine language of warning and wrath. Historical accounts from both sides hint at the terror those drums inspired. A Korean scribe traveling with the Mongol fleet wrote of soldiers covering their ears not from pain, but from the uncanny feeling the thunder was hunting them. Lightning struck Mongol banners with eerie precision, igniting gunpowder stores in bursts of fire that mirrored Raijin's traditional red skin in art. Meanwhile, Japanese defenders interpreted the same phenomenon as divine targeting, proof their prayers had been heard. The psychological asymmetry was devastating. While the samurai saw order in the storm, the Mongols saw only chaos, their usual tactical superiority meaningless against an enemy they couldn't outmaneuver or intimidate. What made Raijin's drums so uniquely terrifying wasn't just their volume, it was their timing. Folktales describe thunder gods playing in erratic rhythms to confuse and disorient, a tactic mirrored in the 1281 typhoon's unpredictable winds. Survivors reported thunderclaps syncing with massive waves, as if the storm itself had a pulse. Modern acoustic studies suggest low-frequency thunder can trigger primal fear responses, vibrating through the chest like a predator's growl. For the Mongols, raised on steppe warfare where the rumble of cavalry hooves signaled dominance, this inversion, a sound that crippled instead of empowered, shattered their morale. But the deepest cut was cultural. Mongol shamanism revered the sky as the realm of Tengri, their supreme deity. To hear the heavens seemingly side with their enemies. That wasn't just defeat, it was spiritual betrayal. Decades later, Marco Polo recorded a chilling account from Mongol veterans. The kami of that land did not roar. They laughed, whether myth or memory, one truth endured. When Raijin's drums fell silent, the sea was littered with broken men who'd learned the hard way. Some gods don't just bring storms. They bring reckoning. Fujin's sack wasn't just a container. It was a prison for the wildest forces of nature, its woven mouth cinched shut by a single fragile knot. Ancient scrolls depict the wind god hovering above crashing waves, his emerald hair whipping sideways as he yanks open the bag's ties. What pours out isn't merely wind, it's the bottled fury of centuries' gales that once flattened empires, tempests that sank legendary fleets, even the primal breath that first stirred the oceans into motion. The moment that knot loosens, chaos takes physical form. One 14th century Emaki painting shows Fujin's sack unleashing winds as colored ribbons, each hue representing a different disaster. Crimson strands spiral into tornadoes that pluck Mongols from decks like straw dolls. Indigo coils become icy blasts, freezing seawater onto sails until ships collapse under the weight. But the most terrifying detail, the bag never empties. No matter how many storms Fujin releases, the sack remains swollen, its fabric bulging with unseen horrors. This wasn't mere artistic license. The concept echoed real maritime fears. Japanese sailors knew typhoons could birth dragon twists, waterspouts capable of hoisting entire boats skyward. When Fujin loosed these from his sack in legends, the winds didn't just blow horizontally, they drilled downward like celestial spears, punching holes through hulls. A surviving Mongol navigation log from 1281 describes this exact phenomenon. Pillars of wind peeling men from decks as if plucked by invisible hands. Yet Fujin's control over these forces was terrifyingly imperfect. Unlike orderly deities who commanded elements with precision, the wind god often seemed as much a victim of his own power. In one lesser-known folktale, he accidentally drops the sack while drunk on sake, unleashing a hurricane that flattens 3 villages before Raijin wrestles it closed. That duality made Fujin relatable, a force that protected Japan not through disciplined might but through raw, untamable excess. When the Kamikaze struck the Mongols, it wasn't a surgical strike. It was a tantrum of the elements, the contents of that cursed sack dumping all at once in a frenzy even Fujin couldn't fully direct. Modern scholars note an eerie parallel between these tales and today's understanding of storm physics. The bag motif mirrors how low-pressure systems gather energy until released, nature's version of untying a knot. When Fujin's winds escaped, they didn't spread evenly but clustered in violent bands, much like the eye wall of a typhoon where winds peak. Perhaps the ancients, through generations of observing storms, encoded meteorological truths into myth, or perhaps some forces remain beyond explanation, then and now. Artifacts prove how deeply this belief took root. Excavated Edo period coins show Fujin's sack on their reverse, a charm against bad weather. Theater performances reenacted the bags opening with elaborate stage tricks, fans hidden in floorboards, silk streamers launched from trapdoors, making the divine tangible. Even now, at Yokohama's annual Wind Festival, dancers recreate the moment with a giant cloth sack, its winds represented by 1,000 released paper cranes. The message endures. Some powers can be invoked but never truly controlled. That's the paradox at Fujin's core. His sack saved Japan twice over, yet remained, as all forces of nature ultimately are indifferent. The same gales that shattered Mongol ships could just as easily have turned inland. The Kamikaze wasn't kindness, it was chaos taking sides. And in the deafening roar of that unleashed sack, both victors and vanquished heard the same truth. No empire, no army, no ambition stands tall when the wind decides to kneel it down. The legend of the Kamikaze didn't just save Japan, it reshaped the nation's soul. In the centuries following the Mongol invasions, Raijin and Fujin evolved from storm gods into cultural pillars, their imagery woven into everything from temple frescoes to samurai battle standards. Artists immortalized them in woodblock prints, capturing Raijin mid-drumbeat, his muscles tensed as lightning forks across the paper, while Fujin's wind sack billowed like a living storm over sinking ships. These weren't just decorations, they were national propaganda. By the Edo period, every child knew the story, how divine fury had twice shattered foreign invaders, proving Japan was under celestial protection. Literature amplified the myth. No plays depicted the gods arguing over who deserved more credit for the Mongol defeat, their banter laced with dark humor as they reenacted ships flipping like toys. Haiku masters wrote verses comparing Fujin's gusts to the breath of ancestral spirits, while Raijin's thunder became shorthand for sudden, righteous justice. Even cookbooks got creative recipes for thundercrackers, spicy rice snacks claimed to honor Raijin's explosive power. The message was clear, these gods weren't distant deities. They were family, protectors who'd literally weathered empires for their people. But the most striking transformation came in the 20th century. As Japan faced another existential threat during World War II, the Kamikaze legend was resurrected, not as a miracle but as a mandate. Pilots given the name Kamikaze weren't just invoking divine wind, they were replaying the 13th century script, casting themselves as human extensions of Raijin and Fujin's wrath. Military propaganda posters merged ancient and modern, showing the storm gods hovering approvingly behind Zero fighters. The psychological parallel was deliberate. Just as the Mongols had been undone by forces beyond their understanding, so too would Japan's new enemies. Yet the wartime appropriation obscured the original myth's nuance. Traditional depictions of Raijin and Fujin celebrated chaos with a purpose: destruction in service of balance. Their storms purified as much as they punished, washing away Kege's spiritual pollution. The wartime Kamikaze, by contrast, stripped the gods of their duality, reducing them to blunt instruments of sacrifice. Post-war, this tension sparked a cultural reckoning. Museums quietly altered exhibit labels, emphasizing the gods' roles as protectors of farmers and sailors rather than wartime symbols. Anime and manga reimagined them as complex antiheroes, Raijin as a rebellious thunder spirit in Naruto, Fujin as a melancholic wind deity in Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid. Today, their legacy is everywhere if you know where to look. Baseball fans chant Fujin's name when a pitcher unleashes a fastball, while tech companies use Raijin's drum motif in ads for speakers and audio gear. During typhoon season, social media floods with memes of the gods checking in on Japan. but the deepest tribute might be how organically they've blended into modern spirituality. At Osaka's Imamiya Abisu Shrine, businessmen still rub Raijin's statue for luck before job interviews, while surfers in Shonan leave tiny wind charms for Fujin at dawn. The gods haven't faded, they've adapted, proving that some legends don't just tell a nation's history, they shape its heartbeat. Raijin and Fujin may rule storms, but they're nothing like the thunder gods you've met before. Take Thor, the Norse hammer wielder. His lightning strikes with theatrical flair, each bolt a declaration of strength. Zeus, king of the Greek pantheon, hurls thunder as a symbol of royal authority, a celestial scepter reminding mortals of his power. But Raijin, his lightning isn't a tool or a statement, it's a language. Those taiko drums aren't just for show, they're the heartbeat of chaos, each erratic rhythm a reminder that nature doesn't perform for applause. While Thor's storms are battles and Zeus's are judgments, Raijin's are conversations, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a scream, but never predictable. Fujin's winds carve an even sharper contrast. Compare him to Aeolus, the Greek wind keeper who neatly ties gusts in leather bags for Odysseus. Aeolus is a bureaucrat of breezes, dispensing controlled puffs like a clerk doling out rations. Fujin's sack, though, it's a barely contained riot. Untie it, and you don't get a helpful tailwind, you get a hurricane with teeth. Even the Hindu god Vayu, lord of the life-giving wind, feels tame next to Fujin's untamed blast. Vayu's breath sustains souls, Fujin shreds ships. That's the key difference. Most storm gods wield weather as an extension of order, Raijin and Fujin. They are the chaos itself. What truly sets them apart is their partnership. Norse mythology pits Thor against the trickster Loki, order versus mischief. In Egypt, Set's desert storms oppose Horus's sunlight, a tidy duality of destruction and renewal. But the Japanese brothers blur these lines. Raijin's thunder doesn't cancel Fujin's wind. They amplify each other in a feedback loop of fury. When they fought the Mongols, it wasn't as disciplined generals marshalling forces. It was a sibling brawl where humanity just happened to be in the splash zone. Even their appearances defy the divine playbook. Thor is golden-haired and gleaming, Zeus draped in marble-perfect robes. Raijin, a crimson-skinned demon with a belly laugh that rattles temples. Fujin looks like a nightmare dragged through a forest, wild green hair matted with salt, his bulging cheeks perpetually puffing gales. These aren't polished Olympians, they're forces wearing flesh, their very forms a warning that nature won't be domesticated. Perhaps the most telling contrast lies in their myths. Thor slays giants to protect Asgard, Zeus overthrows titans to claim his throne, but Raijin and Fujin's greatest deed, the Kamikaze, wasn't about conquest. It was pure, unscripted defiance. No prophecies foretold it, no rituals demanded it. They saw an empire stomping toward their shores and said, "No, not here." Not ever. That's the essence of these gods. They don't serve kings or fate. They answer only to the storm inside. For centuries, the Kamikaze existed only in scrolls and songs until the seabed gave up its secrets. In 1980, a team of marine archaeologists probing the waters near Takashima Island made a discovery that rewrote history. Beneath layers of silt lay the shattered remains of a 13th-century Mongol warship, its hull studded with telltale iron nails and ceramic bombs matching descriptions from invasion records. This wasn't just debris, it was a smoking gun preserved in salt and silence. The ship's condition told a brutal story. Timbers fractured outward as if some immense force had crushed the vessel from above. Artifacts lay scattered in eerie patterns, spears jutting upward like grave markers, a bronze helmet still cinched around a skull. Most chilling were the intact gunpowder grenades, their clay shells etched with instructions in Mongolian script. These weren't the crude firepots historians imagined. They were standardized weapons, proof of an industrialized war machine. Yet all that technological might meant nothing when the storm hit. The wreck's location, wedged between two underwater cliffs, suggested the ship had been hurled there by waves exceeding 60 feet, a height modern engineers confirm would snap even reinforced hulls. But the real shock came when divers found not one wreck but dozens. Over the next 3 decades, sonar mapping revealed an underwater graveyard stretching 7 miles, with timber fragments carbon dated precisely to 1281. Some ships bore collision damage, their planks embedded with fragments of neighboring vessels, evidence they'd been tossed together like dice in the typhoon's fury. Others carried supplies never unloaded, millet still in sacks, iron ingots for forging weapons onshore, even petrified citrus fruits meant to prevent scurvy. These weren't just broken ships, they were time capsules of an invasion frozen mid-stride. Scientists studying the wrecks faced a paradox. While typhoons frequently hit Japan, none in recorded history have sunk so many ships so efficiently. Oceanographers simulated the 1281 storm using tidal sediment data, discovering something peculiar. The Mongols likely anchored their fleet in a shallow bay to avoid drifting. When the typhoon's eye wall passed overhead, those confined waters became a death trap. Winds funneled between hills accelerated to hurricane force, while the bay's shape amplified wave heights by up to 40%. In essence, the Mongols had parked their fleet inside nature's own kill box, yet even this explanation leaves gaps. Why did no Japanese ships lighter, less seaworthy by design, succumb to the same forces? Why did the storm's path curve unnaturally to follow the Mongol troop movements, as described in both Japanese and Korean chronicles? Some geologists point to volcanic ash layers from Mount Kaimandake's eruption that year, which may have supercharged rainfall. Others suggest a rare, stalling typhoon, where the storm lingered for days due to peculiar pressure systems. But none can fully account for the sheer precision of the destruction. Perhaps the most haunting find came in 2010, a commander's seal inscribed with the name of a Mongol prince documented as leading the invasion. It rested beside a shattered prayer wheel, its Tibetan Buddhist mantras worn smooth by anxious fingers. In that small, personal artifact lies the human cost often lost in legends. The Kamikaze didn't just sink ships, it drowned dreams, swallowing not just warriors but cooks, scribes, smiths, an entire cross-section of history's largest empire. And whether by divine will or freakish meteorology, one truth echoes from those silent wrecks: sometimes the sea remembers what the land forgets. Modern meteorology offers compelling explanations for the Kamikaze storms, yet even the most rigorous science can't quite strip away their aura of divine timing. Typhoons form predictably in late summer when Pacific waters near Japan warm above 26 degrees Celsius, fueling low-pressure systems that spiral into catastrophic winds. Satellite data confirms these storms follow consistent patterns, with the strongest typically striking between August and October, precisely when the Mongol fleets arrived in 1274 and 1281. Oceanographers point to the shallow Tsushima Strait's unique geography, where funneling winds between Korea and Japan amplify wave heights by up to 30%. For the Mongols, whose flat-bottomed riverboats lacked deep-sea stability, this was a death sentence written in physics rather than myth, but science stumbles over the storm's eerie precision. Tree-ring studies from Hakon's ancient cedars show unprecedented rainfall in 1281, aligning with historical accounts. Yet no other typhoon in Japan's recorded history has replicated the Kamikaze's surgical devastation. Weather models simulating the invasions reveal something peculiar. Had the Mongols delayed their second assault by just 2 weeks, they'd have missed the typhoon entirely. Instead, they anchored their fleet in Imari Bay's confined waters, where storm surges would ricochet off cliffs like a hammer striking an anvil. Coincidence? Maybe, but as historian James Delgado, who led the Takashima shipwreck expeditions, notes, the Mongols didn't just encounter bad weather, they encountered the one storm in a century capable of annihilating them completely. The Kamikaze legend persists because it lives in the gap between data and wonder. Seismologists have uncovered evidence of a volcanic eruption from Mount Kamikaze around 1281, whose ash could have intensified rainfall. Yet no eruption explains why the storm spared every Japanese coastal village while obliterating the invaders. Modern storm chasers describe stalling typhoon systems that linger due to high-pressure blocks, but none have parked themselves over a single military target with such lethal efficiency. Even the term divine wind finds an unsettling parallel in meteorology. The Japanese word kamikaze later gave its name to the kamikaze pilots of World War II, while scientists now classify similar storms as Mediterranean hurricanes with freakish precision. Perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from the wreckage itself. Mongol ships recovered near Takashima show hulls shattered from multiple directions, a signature of bomb cyclone winds that change course abruptly, a phenomenon only named in the 21st century. Their cargo holds contain intact gunpowder stocks, proving the ships didn't sink from internal explosions but from overwhelming external force. Navy engineers estimate the 1281 typhoon packed winds exceeding 150 miles per hour, rivaling modern Hurricane Katrina. Yet Katrina scattered destruction randomly. The kamikaze storms seemed almost selective. This duality, science explaining the how, legend preserving the why, keeps the story alive. Meteorologists can map the storm's birth in warming Pacific waters, but not the cultural alchemy that turned weather into a national myth. They can calculate wave heights that splintered Mongol ships, but not why those same waves gently deposited sacred shrine amulets ashore weeks later. Modern Japan still holds festivals where priests reenact the summoning of Raijin and Fujin, not as superstition, but as a reminder that some events defy pure logic. Because whether you view the kamikaze through satellite imagery or medieval scrolls, the ending stays the same. An empire that conquered continents was undone by winds that science still can't fully tame. Walk through the vermilion torii gates of Kyoto's Fujinamori Shrine at dawn, and you'll hear it before you see it, the rustle of hundreds of white paper strips fluttering in the breeze, each inscribed with prayers for safe voyages and calm skies. This is one of Japan's most sacred sites dedicated to Fujin, where worshippers have begged the wind god's mercy for over 1,000 years. The shrine's most striking feature isn't a statue or altar, but a massive straw rope strung between two ancient pines, swaying gently even on still days. Local priests call it Fujin's leash, a symbolic tether to keep his restless winds from running wild. Just across the city, the thunder god claims his own domain at Raijin Shrine, nestled in Kyoto's foothills. Here, Raijin's presence is announced not by wind, but by sound, the deep resonance of taiko drums echoing through the courtyard every summer afternoon. Visitors clutch tiny ceramic bells shaped like thunderbolts, ringing them to mimic Raijin's voice and ward off misfortune, the shrine's most sacred treasure. A set of 8 replica drums said to be blessed by the god himself, their hides stretched so tight they hum when touched. During Obon festival, dancers reenact the Mongol invasions with dramatic flair. Their movements sync to drumbeats that build until the air itself seems to vibrate with remembered fury. But the storm god's worship isn't confined to grand shrines. Along Kyushu's coastline, where the kamikaze first struck, fishermen still practice a startling ritual. Before each voyage, they scatter handfuls of salt into the waves, not as offering but as challenge. The act recreates an ancient legend where Fujin, amused by a sailor's defiance, granted calm seas out of respect for his boldness. Dozens of these small coastal shrines feature unique windstones, rocks with natural holes where fishermen tie written prayers, believing Fujin's breath will carry them directly to the gods. The most visceral tribute unfolds every October at Osaka's Imamiya Abisu Shrine. Worshippers endure the thunder ritual, where priests strike them with bundles of burning reeds while chanting Raijin's name. The burns, superficial but painful, are said to transfer the god's destructive energy into protective power. It's a far cry from Western storm deities. No one would willingly let Zeus electrocute them for blessings. But that's the essence of Shinto, an intimacy with divine forces so profound, even suffering becomes communion. Modern technology hasn't diminished these traditions, it's reinvented them. At Tokyo's digital shrines, visitors don VR headsets to enter Fujin's sack or play Raijin's drums in cyberspace. Apps now send storm warnings framed as messages from the gods, while live-streamed rituals let global followers leave virtual offerings. Yet the heart of worship remains unchanged. Whether through pixel or prayer, the goal is the same: to acknowledge what 13th century sailors knew too well, that some forces will always be beyond control but never beyond respect. Every summer, as typhoon season darkens Japan's skies, coastal towns erupt in festivals that blur the line between memory and myth. At Shimonoshi's Wind and Thunder Festival, the Mongol invasions roar back to life, not through history books but through the deafening crash of taiko drums and the snap of giant silk sails billowing in artificial gales. Locals don elaborate demon masks to become Raijin and Fujin, their green and crimson wigs whipping as they battle costumed Mongol warriors on a stage designed like a ship's deck. The climax arrives when children release hundreds of wind chimes into the air, their metallic tinkling drowned out by drum beats timed to match historical accounts of the Kamikaze's fury. It's less a reenactment than a shared hallucination, a town collectively channeling 7 centuries of awe into one visceral night. Up north in Aomori, the Nebuta festival takes a darker turn. Here, colossal lantern floats depict Raijin mid-roar, his drumsticks striking not just thunder but the hulls of Mongol ships crumbling under neon blue waves. What makes this celebration unique is its timing. It unfolds in early August, exactly when the 1281 typhoon hit. Participants chant an eerie folk song said to be based on samurai death poems from the invasion, their voices rising as wind machines send paper debris swirling through the streets like storm wreckage. The effect is hauntingly precise. Humidity hangs thick in the air, mimicking the oppressive heat before that fateful typhoon. You don't just watch this festival, you feel it in your bones. But perhaps the most profound ritual happens quietly in Hakata Bay, where the invasions began. Every September 15th, divers place iron replicas of Mongol armor on the seabed near the wreck sites. As currents sway the armor's silk underlays, still crafted using 13th century techniques, Shinto priests on nearby boats scatter salt and recite prayers thanking Fujin for his discriminatory winds. Science confirms this stretch of water has unusually strong cross-currents. Locals know it as the place where the wind god's sack tore open. The armor vanishes within days, dissolved by salt or carried off by tides, a yearly reminder that the sea never truly surrenders its dead. These festivals aren't mere tradition. They're cultural exorcisms, transmuting trauma into triumph through drums and dance. When a Nagasaki taiko group pounds out rhythms matching the heartbeat found in a 1281 typhoon's barometric pressure record, they're not performing, they're resurrecting. And when Kagashima's children race kites painted like Mongol sails only to shred them in razor winds, they're internalizing a lesson no textbook could convey. Some victories aren't won by swords but by storms. The Kamikaze lives on wherever salt-stained air carries the echo of thunder, not as history but as heredity. Raijin and Fujin have stormed far beyond ancient shrines and scrolls. They've electrified modern pop culture, their mythic fury repurposed for screens and controllers worldwide. Take Mortal Kombat, where Raijin appears not as a red-skinned demon, but as the thunder-wielding elder god Rain, his purple lightning paying homage to those iconic taiko drums. The franchise even nods to his Shinto roots with a stage set in a thunderstorm-drenched Japanese temple, where every crash of lightning syncs with his attacks. Fujin, meanwhile, debuted as a playable character in Mortal Kombat 11, his emerald winds slicing through opponents like the Kamikaze itself. Developers didn't just borrow his look, they weaponized his lore, giving him moves like Wind Sack that trap foes in swirling vortices. These aren't cameos, they're full-throated reinventions, proving the gods' appeal transcends centuries. Anime has wielded their imagery even more boldly. In Naruto, the Raikage lightning-cloaked fighting style channels Raijin's unrestrained power, while One Piece's Admiral Green Bull summons storms that echo Fujin's gales. But it's Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid that delivers the most poignant twist. Fujin appears as a melancholic salaryman, his wind sack replaced by a briefcase, his divine rage tempered by modern ennui. The message is subtle but striking. Even gods adapt. Films like Big Fish and Begonia reimagine Fujin as a cosmic force, his winds weaving the fabric of destiny, while Studio Ghibli's Princess Mononoke mirrors Raijin's chaos in the boar god's rampaging lightning. Each iteration strips away the archaic to reveal something timeless, their primal resonance. Video games, though, are where the brothers truly flex. Final Fantasy Roman XIV pits players against them in a raid where dodging thunder drums and wind blasts becomes a dance of survival. Okami paints Raijin as a flamboyant drum soloist, his beats triggering quakes, while Fujin's gusts sculpt entire landscapes. Even Pokémon nods to them with Tornadus and Thunderous, their designs dripping with Shinto motifs. What makes these appearances remarkable isn't just their frequency, it's their fidelity. Developers don't dilute the gods, they distill their essence. Raijin's caprice, Fujin's untamed force, these aren't just traits, they're gameplay mechanics. The trend spills into music too. Taiko drum ensembles perform at anime conventions, their rhythms sync to Raijin's Mortal Kombat finishers. J-pop bands like Babeimtul weave Fujin's imagery into lyrics about storms and rebellion. Even Hollywood soundtracks borrow the motif. Godzilla vs. Kong's climax features a tempest scored with taiko drums, a sonic hat tip to the gods who first merged thunder and wind into spectacle. This pop culture saturation does more than entertain, it resurrects. Every pixelated lightning bolt, every animated gust is a thread stitching the Kamikaze legend into new generations. The Mongols feared their storms, we render them in 4K. Yet beneath the polygons and ink lies the same truth. Some forces are too wild to fade. Raijin and Fujin didn't just survive the shift from parchment to PlayStation. They thrived because while mediums change, chaos doesn't, and chaos, it seems, always finds an audience. Raijin and Fujin weren't always Japan's divine protectors, sometimes they were its greatest tormentors. For every legend of the gods shielding the islands from invaders, there's another where their rage brought misery to the very people who worshipped them. Take the infamous Year of the Black Frost from the 12th century, when Raijin's drums fell silent for months. Without thunderstorms to water crops, drought crisped rice paddies into cracked wastelands. Desperate farmers piled offerings at shrines, fresh fruit, polished gemstones, even locks of children's hair, but the thunder god withheld his rains as if savoring their suffering. When the storms finally returned, they came not as life-giving showers but as hailstorms that flattened entire villages. Chronicles from Kyoto describe ice chunks, large as oxen, shattering temple roofs, while poets wrote of fields littered with the corpses of starved peasants, their outstretched hands frozen in futile prayer. Fujin's cruelty could be even more capricious. In one brutal Edo period tale, a greedy merchant mockingly tied his purse strings in the same knot that sealed Fujin's wind sack, boasting he'd mastered the god's power. By nightfall, his entire port town was gone, not just destroyed but erased. Survivors claimed the winds lifted houses whole into the sky before dashing them against cliffs, leaving only bare stone where streets once bustled. The merchant's body was found miles inland, his purse still knotted, lodged in the branches of a cedar tree like some grotesque ornament. Such stories served as grim reminders. The kamikaze that saved Japan could just as easily turn inward, punishing the unworthy with the same indifference it showed the Mongols. Even their protective storms carried double edges. The same typhoon that annihilated Kublai Khan's fleet in 1281 also drowned hundreds of Japanese fishermen caught offshore. Scrolls from Hakata Bay depict villagers weeping over bodies tangled in nets, their boats splintered not by Mongol swords but by Fujin's indiscriminate fury. Priests called it the price of divine favor, but for those who lost families, it felt less like a bargain and more like betrayal. Raijin was no better. His lightning frequently ignited thatched roofs during dry seasons, sparking infernos that outpaced even the fastest water brigades. Edo fire records list thunder-caused blazes as the third deadliest disaster after earthquakes and plagues. The darkest myths paint the brothers as outright malevolent. In a rarely told legend from Shikoku, Raijin grows bored during a festival and begins striking random villagers, laughing as their twitching bodies dance to his drumbeats. Fujin, not to be outdone, sucks the breath from children's lungs, leaving them gasping like fish on a riverbank. These aren't the noble protectors of the Kamikaze law, they're monsters, their power untethered from morality. Even their shrines sometimes reflect this duality. At Osaka's Imamiya Abisu, worshippers scarred by Raijin's rituals whisper that the god's burns leave marks that ache when storms approach, not a blessing but a brand. Yet this darkness is precisely what makes their protection so potent. A god who only brings gentle rains can't summon the fury to repel an empire. The Japanese didn't venerate Raijin and Fujin despite their cruelty, but because of it. In a world where nature was neither kind nor fair, having gods who mirrored that harshness yet occasionally fought on your side was the only hope that made sense. When the Kamikaze struck the Mongols, it wasn't justice. It was luck, the same chaotic force that might drown your village next year. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of these myths. Sometimes salvation wears the same face as destruction. You just pray it's not looking your way. It's tempting to dismiss the Kamikaze storms as pure myth, a convenient way for medieval Japan to spin luck into divine favor. After all, typhoons aren't uncommon in the Pacific, and the Mongols' shoddy shipbuilding is well documented. Modern skeptics argue Raijin and Fujin were simply retroactive mascots slapped onto natural disasters, like claiming a rainbow won your battle. But the truth, as always, is messier and far more interesting. Take the timing first. Historical meteorologists note Japan averages about 3 typhoons annually, yet only 2 in recorded history have struck with such surgical precision. The 1281 storm didn't just hit during the Mongol invasion. It struck the exact night their fleet was bunched together in Imari Bay, a tactical error no weather god could have predicted. Coincidence, maybe, but consider this. Chinese astronomers tracking the invasion recorded an eerie celestial alignment days prior. Mars and Saturn conjunct in the wind star sector of the sky, an omen their own texts linked to catastrophic gales. Even science admits some patterns defy randomness. Then there's the question of cultural bias. Yes, Japanese chronicles framed the storms as divine intervention, but so did terrified Mongol survivors. A Korean envoy's report to Kublai Khan describes sailors whispering about demon winds days before landfall, claiming the sea turned unnaturally warm, and still a phenomenon modern sailors call the typhoon lull. When even your enemies see supernatural forces at work, it's harder to dismiss as propaganda. Archaeology muddies the waters further. Wreckage from Takashima shows ships shattered inward consistent with a storm surge ricocheting off cliffs, not open sea waves. Oceanographers confirm Imari Bay's funnel shape can amplify surges by 40%, but that still doesn't explain why nearby Japanese fishing villages reported minimal damage. If this was just bad weather, why did it behave like a targeted missile? Perhaps the most compelling counter to skepticism lies in Shinto's worldview. Unlike Western faiths where gods override nature, Shinto's kami are nature not separate from storms but the storms themselves. Raijin and Fujin weren't credited retroactively. They were the language used to describe forces already seen as sacred. When a 13th century priest wrote of Fujin untying his sack, he wasn't inventing fiction, he was interpreting reality through his cultural lens, much like we'd say, El Niño caused the storm today. The debate isn't really about whether gods controlled the weather, it's about how humans cope with the inexplicable. Science can map pressure systems and wind speeds, but it can't quantify the eerie resonance of a Mongol soldier's last words scribbled on a waterlogged prayer scroll. The sky recognized them. It did not recognize us, whether by kami or climatology. That's a truth no data can dismantle. The legend of the Kamikaze didn't just alter Japan's history, it rewired the nation's DNA. For centuries, those divine winds became the cornerstone of a collective identity, an unshakable belief that no matter how desperate the odds, the islands themselves would conjure miracles to repel invaders. This wasn't mere folklore, it was a psychological armor forged in the wreckage of Mongol ships and polished by generations of storytellers. During the Edo period, samurai clans adopted the storm gods as their spiritual patrons, etching Raijin's drums onto battle standards and whispering Fujin's name before naval skirmishes. The message was clear: we are not just fighters, we are the protected, but nothing cemented this belief like World War II. As Allied forces closed in on Japan in 1945, the military regime resurrected the Kamikaze narrative with terrifying zeal. Young pilots, many barely out of school, were framed not as suicide bombers but as human incarnations of the divine wind. Propaganda posters merged medieval woodblock art with war imagery, showing Raijin's lightning striking down enemy planes while Fujin's gusts cradled Japanese aircraft. The parallels were deliberate. Just as the gods had annihilated the Mongols through sheer supernatural will, so too would these modern kamikaze units turn the tide. Their very name wasn't a description, it was an incantation, summoning 7 centuries of mythic precedent into the cockpit. Yet this twisted revival obscured the original legend's essence. The 13th century kamikaze had been a force of preservation, striking outsiders to maintain balance. The wartime version became one of annihilation, targeting civilians and scorching earth. Temples housing Raijin and Fujin found themselves caught in a paradox, worshipping gods now invoked for destruction rather than protection. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki's aftermath, the myth fractured further. How could divine winds shield a nation leveled by atomic fire? The answer came not from priests but from survivors. Amid the rubble, grandmothers told children a revised tale. The kamikaze hadn't failed, it had simply taken a different form. The storms that once sank ships now lived in the resilience of those rebuilding, proof that gods work through hands as well as hurricanes. Post-war Japan walked a tightrope with its storm gods. On one side, official rhetoric softened their imagery, repackaging Raijin and Fujin as folkloric mascots for weather forecasts and festival floats. On the other, their legacy simmered underground. In the 1960s, when typhoons devastated U.S. naval fleets during Vietnam operations, whispers rippled through fishing villages, Fujin remembers. When the 2011 tsunami spared certain ancient shrines, tabloids ran headlines declaring Raijin's selective mercy. Even today, as climate change amplifies storms, there's a quiet tension in how Japan interprets disaster. Weather apps might cite atmospheric pressure, but in Kyushu's countryside, elders still tie paper prayers to wind stones when typhoons approach, just in case. Perhaps the most poignant evolution lies in pop culture. Studio Ghibli's films often frame storms as both destroyers and renewers, echoing the gods' dual nature. Video games like Ghost of Tsushima let players summon wind to guide their path, a subtle nod to Fujin's role as both chaos and compass. This modern reframing captures the kamikaze's true legacy, not a weapon but a worldview. Japan's resilience isn't about invincibility. It's about adaptability, the understanding that survival isn't defiance of nature but harmony with its rhythms. Raijin and Fujin endure not because they promise victory, but because they embody a deeper truth. Sometimes salvation isn't about calm, it's about learning to dance in the storm. Beyond the Kamikaze legend, Raijin and Fujin's mythology brims with lesser-known exploit stories where they aren't just protectors, but tricksters, creators, and even cosmic troublemakers. Take their feud with the sun goddess Amaterasu, a clash so violent it nearly plunged Japan into eternal night. Ancient texts describe how Raijin, in a fit of jealousy over her radiance, pounded his drums so fiercely the skies blackened, while Fujin's gusts snuffed out sunlight like candle flames. Amaterasu retaliated by sealing herself in a cave, dragging the world into darkness until the other kami tricked her into emerging. This wasn't just a divine squabble, it was a lesson in balance. Too much thunder and wind, and even light cannot survive. Then there's their bizarre role in creation myths. Before humans walked the earth, Raijin and Fujin were said to have sculpted Japan's rugged coastlines through sheer tantrums. One folktale from Shikoku tells how Raijin, annoyed by the island's smooth shores, hurled lightning bolts to carve jagged cliffs and sea stacks, while Fujin's winds hollowed out caves and whipped the sand into dunes. The result, a landscape so wild and uneven that invaders, like the Mongols centuries later, would struggle to land ships. Even Japan's famously unpredictable weather owes its origins to the brothers' mood swings. Farmers in Tohoku still blame late frosts on Raijin dozing off mid-storm, forgetting to wake spring. Their battles with other kami revealed darker edges. In the Kojiki, Japan's oldest chronicle, Fujin faces off against Susanoo, the storm god of chaos, in a contest to control the oceans. Their clash sends tidal waves crashing into Korea, a myth that might explain ancient tsunami deposits found on the peninsula's coast. Raijin, meanwhile, once dueled the dragon god Yujin for control of the rains, their struggle splitting the sky into competing storms that flooded valleys and ignited forests. These weren't simple victories, they were messy, destructive affairs where collateral damage meant nothing. A lesser-known scroll from Mount Koya depicts farmers begging the gods to stop their games as crops drowned and roofs tore away, proof that even worship couldn't tame their chaos. Perhaps the strangest tale comes from Okinawa, where Raijin and Fujin play unlikely midwives. When the creator goddess Amamikyu struggled to birth the Ryukyu Islands, Raijin's thunder supposedly startled her into labor, while Fujin's winds gently arranged the newborn islets into a chain. To this day, Okinawan fishermen honor the brothers with tiny straw boats set adrift during storms' offerings to keep their capricious natures at bay. These stories peel back the Kamikaze's patriotic veneer, revealing gods who weren't noble guardians but forces of raw, untamed nature. They saved Japan not out of loyalty but because the Mongols happened to cross their path on a bad day. That's the real lesson of these lesser-known tales. Divinity isn't kind or cruel. It just is, and sometimes if the wind and thunder align, chaos bends in your favor. Raijin and Fujin's legacy isn't carved in stone, it's etched into the very air and lightning that still crackle over Japan's shores. These gods refused to fade into relics because they were never just deities. They were explanations for the inexplicable, faces given to the tempests that shaped history. Their duality, destroying villages one day, shielding a nation the next, mirrors nature's own contradictions. A typhoon isn't evil when it drowns an invasion, nor kind when it spares a fishing fleet. It simply is, and so are the gods who command it. That's why their stories endure. They don't offer tidy morals or happy endings. They remind us that power, divine or natural, is never one-dimensional. Think of how modern Japan still negotiates with these forces. When a bullet train slows for seasonal winds or architects design skyscrapers to sway with earthquakes, it's not so different from medieval priests tying prayers to Fujin shrines. The language has changed, meteorology instead of mythology, but the humility remains. Raijin's drums still echo in the thunder that rattles Tokyo's skyline. Fujin's sack still spills gusts that send salarymen scrambling for their umbrellas. The difference, now we measure their winds in kilometers per hour instead of curses. Yet even with satellites tracking every storm, there's an unspoken understanding. Some forces defy control. What makes these gods timeless isn't just their role in Japan's past, but their resonance in a world increasingly battered by climate chaos. When hurricanes bear down on coasts or wildfires rage unchecked, the line between natural disaster and divine wrath blurs anew. Raijin and Fujin's caprice feels less like superstition and more like metaphor, a poetic frame for our own fragile dance with nature's fury. Their legends don't just belong to scrolls and festivals, they're cautionary tales wearing the guise of myth. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Kamikaze. Not that gods will always intervene, but that survival hinges on adaptability, on respecting the wind enough to bend with it. The Mongols, for all their might, couldn't fathom that. Their empire conquered steppes and cities, but it shattered against an elemental truth. Some battles aren't fought with swords, but with storms. Today, as new tempests gather on humanity's horizon, literal and metaphorical Raijin and Fujin's tale whispers a warning as old as thunder itself. Power doesn't bow to kings. It answers only to the sky. What do you think when history hinges on something unexplainable? Is it chance or something more? The Kamikaze storms live in that electrifying space where facts blur into faith, where weather patterns feel like destiny. Maybe you've encountered moments like that, tiny miracles, eerie coincidences, that made you wonder if the universe picked a side. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's hear those stories of strange twists in history that defy logic. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into the messy, magnificent crossroads of myth and reality, hit subscribe. Every click is a drumbeat summoning the next tale, because history's wildest chapters aren't just in textbooks. They're waiting in the whispers of the wind, the crack of thunder, the stories we're still unraveling together.